Early in the morning, the old man Henry was having his breakfast in his small, outdated kitchen. As he looked out of the kitchen window, he noticed his new neighbors across the street. Or rather, he noticed the noise they were making. At this hour, when his breakfast should have been peaceful, the cheerful sounds of children playing in the street were growing louder and louder. Living alone in his small, single-story house, Henry was a man who loved silence. He had lived in this neighborhood for many years, rarely communicating with his neighbors, sometimes even ignoring their presence altogether. But that morning, the children of the new neighbors had disturbed the peace of his breakfast with their noisy play. As he continued to eat his breakfast, he felt something boiling inside him. His irritation slowly started to rise. The children's laughter, their shouting, the sound of the ball bouncing on the pavement. All of these things were enough to push the old man's patience to the limit. He slammed his fork onto his plate. His frustration was evident on his face. He took one last look at the children playing outside, then angrily stood up from his chair and headed for the door. He opened the door forcefully and stepped outside. For a moment, the 4 children playing on the street paused, noticing his presence. They were sweating, having fun, but as soon as they saw Henry's stern expression, they froze. "What are you doing here?" the old man shouted. The children looked at each other and fell silent, as if they had committed a crime. The oldest of them, a boy about 10 years old, gathered his courage and replied, "We're playing soccer, sir. We're not hurting anyone." "You think you're not hurting anyone?" Henry's voice was sharp. "You're waking up the whole neighborhood at this hour. People need some peace, do you understand?" The children lowered their heads. Some of them started drawing lines on the sidewalk with the tips of their shoes. The smallest girl looked up with wide eyes, almost on the verge of tears. But Henry didn't care. They had ruined his morning. Just as he was about to go back inside, the ball rolled right to his feet. It was an old, soft, orange-colored soccer ball. One of the children, trembling, asked, "Excuse me, could we have our ball back?" Henry furrowed his brows. He couldn't hold his anger anymore. He bent down, picked up the ball, then, with a grunt, kicked it forcefully with his foot. The ball exploded with a sharp pop as it hit the pavement. The children's eyes widened in shock. None of them could say a word. They just watched as the pieces of the ball scattered on the ground. "Enough! I don't want to see you playing here again," Henry yelled, then quickly turned and slammed the door behind him. Once inside, his heart was racing. He had released his anger, but there was an odd unease within him. The silence outside was noticeable. The children's laughter was no longer heard. Their shouting had stopped. Only a heavy stillness remained. Henry sighed. He stood there by the door for a moment. Then he approached the window, gently pulled back the curtain, and looked outside. The children were still there, but they weren't playing anymore. The smallest one was staring at the pieces of the broken ball on the ground, while the others tried to console her by touching her shoulder. One of them glanced at Henry's house for a brief moment, then lowered their head and began walking away slowly. The old man sighed again. There was a strange feeling inside him, a sense of emptiness, of regret. But he kept telling himself, "Why should I care? They're not my problem." But what had happened that morning didn't seem like something that could be forgotten so easily. After breakfast, the old man sank into his old brown armchair and began reading his newspaper. As usual, he hoped for a quiet, peaceful day. However, at that moment, he was startled by the sound of running footsteps coming from upstairs. The echo of little feet rapidly descending the stairs reverberated through the walls of the house. The children were racing down the stairs, laughing and playfully pushing each other. Once again, the old man's peace was shattered by their noise. He took a deep breath, clenched his teeth, and folded his newspaper angrily. He got up from his chair. The wooden floor creaked under every step. He grabbed his cane and opened the door forcefully, only to see 3 children at the top of the stairs, laughing at each other. Their carefree attitude only fueled his rising anger. "Are you still here?" he shouted. Despite his age, his voice was still strong and authoritative. The children jumped in surprise and looked up at him. The joy on their faces quickly turned to nervousness. But the youngest, little Emma, barely 6 years old, didn't seem to take the old man's anger seriously. Her eyes were still sparkling, as if she might invite him to join their game. "What's the problem? We're just playing," she mumbled softly. The old man's face grew even sterner. Frowning, he slammed his cane down on the floor. "Just playing? Before you moved in, this building was peaceful, quiet. I've lived here for years, and there's never been such noise. But you came, and now everything is ruined," he shouted in frustration. The children exchanged glances. Little Emma still didn't quite understand the seriousness of the old man's anger, but David, her 10-year-old older brother, looked upset. David knew well how to show respect to adults, but the old man's words were too harsh for him. "We live here too," David whispered. "This building doesn't belong to just you." That response was the last straw for the old man. Taking a few more steps forward, he leaned in toward the children. "Where did you come from, huh? People like you are the reason this neighborhood lost its peace. I wish you'd never moved here. You don't belong here," he said harshly. David's eyes widened. Little Emma's innocent smile faded, and for a moment it felt like a heavy burden was placed on her small heart. Her eyes filled with tears as she moved closer to her brother. Sarah, their 12-year-old older sister, was calm and mature, but even she couldn't hold back her tears. The old man's cruel words had struck deep into the children's hearts. "But we're people too," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We deserve to live here too." The old man paused for a brief moment. His anger still simmered inside, but when he saw the expressions on their faces, his thoughts became momentarily confused. But he didn't feel regret. He silently watched them, then shook his head and sighed deeply. "Do whatever you want," he muttered, slamming the door shut. The children looked at each other, tears in their eyes. In that moment, they felt like they weren't wanted in this building. Little Emma buried her face in her brother's chest and started sobbing uncontrollably. Sarah wrapped her arms around her siblings, trying to protect them. The old man's words had cut deep. That day, on those stairs, the three children had witnessed not just a shout, but discrimination, loneliness, and coldness. And maybe, for the first time, they had felt truly unwelcome. They ran home, crying. There was no need for words. They silently held on to each other and took one last look at the old man's door. Inside them was a sense of sorrow, disappointment, and perhaps the loss of something that would never be the same again. And the old man, behind the door, listened to the silence of his loneliness once more. But this time, the silence was heavier and more disturbing than ever. The sharp cold of the winter months had begun to make itself felt more and more. The snow was falling gently under the street lamps, covering the sidewalks with a white blanket. The new year was approaching, and there was a sweet excitement in the neighborhood. People were decorating their homes, stores were glowing brightly, and the streets were adorned with colorful decorations. The new neighbors were among the most vibrant parts of this joyful atmosphere. The new neighbors were sharing the spirit of the new year by making and distributing sweets around the neighborhood. They had set up a large table filled with fragrant cakes, cookies, and hot chocolate. The children were happily packing the sweets, while their parents carefully placed them in boxes. Although these beautiful moments brought joy to many of the neighborhood residents, they meant nothing to the old man living alone in the old stone house at the corner. That morning, the old man had woken up early and decided to do something he hadn't done in years. Even though he wasn't going to decorate his house, he wanted to at least put a small New Year's decoration in front of his door. As usual, he muttered to himself as he went down the stairs, stopped in front of his door, and took a small pine branch and a few red ribbons out of his pocket. His fingers were slightly trembling as he tried to nail the decoration with his aging hands, continuing to grumble under his breath. At that moment, the new neighbors, who were distributing the sweets across the street, noticed him. The children looked at each other and smiled. They exchanged glances, and one of them gathered the courage to take a box of sweets. The little child carefully walked over to the old man, filled with both excitement and a bit of fear, for this man had never treated them kindly before. But her mother always told her, neighborliness means supporting each other not only in good times, but also in difficult times. "Excuse me," the child said politely. "We brought you a sweet for the new year. My mom and dad made them. I hope you like it." The old man turned his head, his brows furrowed. After making the final touch on the decoration, he slowly turned to the child. For a brief moment, he stared at the box of sweets in her hands. There were freshly baked cookies and a cup of hot chocolate beside them. A shadow passed over his face. There was a strange feeling inside, but he didn't want to accept it. As the child's innocent gaze met his heart hesitated for a moment. But then he placed his usual cold and stern expression back on his face. Without saying anything, he raised his hand and pushed the box of sweets away with the back of his hand. The contents of the box fell to the ground. The cookies scattered across the pavement, and the hot chocolate spilled onto the snow-covered ground. The little child's eyes widened in surprise, and disappointment spread across her face. Her family and siblings, waiting behind her, watched the scene in shock. The old man paused for a moment. He saw the hurt in the child's eyes, but he turned his head as if nothing had happened. He took a deep breath, then turned to his door and walked inside with slow steps. When he slammed the door shut, a deep silence filled the room. Outside, the child continued to look at the sweets that had fallen on the ground. Her mother knelt down beside her and embraced her. "It's okay, dear," she said in a soft voice. "Some people don't know how to accept love, but we will keep doing good for them." In that moment, everyone was silent. The little child lifted her gaze from the fallen sweets and looked at the old man's door. There was a sadness in her heart, but her mother's words somehow gave her strength. After entering, the old man placed his hand on his chest and took a deep breath. His heart was racing. He felt strange. He sat by the window looking outside. The child and her family were gathering the fallen sweets, smiling and supporting each other. He felt a strange emptiness inside. For a moment, he wondered if he was truly alone. But then he shook his head and closed his eyes, muttering under his breath. The love and warmth outside seemed so far away, or perhaps he had pushed it that far away. The new year was approaching, but in his heart there was still the coldness of the old year. In the early hours of the morning, the air was cold and still. The streets were quiet, with only a few bird sounds in the air. As usual, the old man opened his door with heavy steps to go for his morning walk. He took a deep breath, but as the cold air filled his lungs, he suddenly felt a dizzy spell. He took another deep breath and stepped outside. At that moment, he ran into his new neighbors. The children were joyfully spinning around their mother, while the father was busy carrying bags. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The old man's face had his usual stern expression. The neighbors, however, smiled at him warmly, but he didn't respond. Just then, his phone started ringing from his pocket. He took the phone out of his pocket and, seeing a strange number, hesitated for a moment but answered anyway. "Hello?" he answered, his voice as harsh as always. But within seconds, his expression changed. First, his brows furrowed, then his eyes widened. "What?" he said in a trembling voice. "How could this happen? Are you sure?" The person on the other end spoke calmly but firmly. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the phone more tightly, yet he looked as if his world had come crashing down. Finally, after ending the conversation, he dropped the phone from his hands. The device hit the sidewalk and rolled with a small clink. The old man stood still, staring at the ground, his face pale and his eyes glazed over. The neighbors watched him in astonishment. Although the children didn't understand, the parents noticed the change in the old man's expression. The woman gently touched her husband's arm and whispered, "I wonder what happened." The man's heart tightened, but he said nothing, just watched the old man. The old man, noticing that the neighbors were watching him, quickly bent down and picked up the phone from the ground. His eyes were moist, but he tried to compose himself. He turned his head and hurried back to his house. His legs seemed to struggle with each step, and his breath became uneven. When he reached his door, he quickly took out his key and with trembling hands opened the door and stepped inside, slamming the door behind him. The neighbors stood in stunned silence, staring at his door. An hour passed. The street remained quiet. The neighbors noticed that there was no movement in the old man's house. While the children played joyfully, the parents looked curiously at the old man's door. At that moment, the old man opened his door again, but this time he was holding a piece of paper. He stepped outside and pasted the paper onto his door. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, but didn't fall. After sticking the paper, the old man paused for a moment, took a deep breath, then reached for the Christmas ornament next to the door and pulled it off. After holding it for a while, he dropped it, and with a small crack, it split in two. The neighbors, curious to see what was written on the paper, approached the door. The paper had the following words written in shaky handwriting: "I am COVID. Stay away from me." The woman put her hand to her mouth and sighed deeply. The man, too, looked at the paper for a long time. The children, noticing their parents pausing, came over to try to read the message. The youngest asked, "What does this mean?" The parents looked at each other but couldn't answer. When the old man shut his door and went inside, he looked out the window. For the first time, he truly felt alone. The usual noise that he had gotten used to felt foreign to him now. Something inside him had broken. But worst of all, it wasn't just his body that was sick, but his soul as well. After reading the paper, the new neighbors stood in silence for a while. The woman took a deep breath and whispered to her husband, "Do you think he's really that lonely?" The man shook his head. "I think he feels more than just loneliness," he replied. The children, unable to make sense of the situation, looked at their parents, but at that moment, one thing was clear in everyone's mind. Did this old man really want to stay this lonely? The neighbor children were deeply saddened to learn that the old man had COVID. Despite all the injustices he had done to them, the children couldn't bring themselves to treat him badly. They knew from what their mothers had taught them that doing good was the right thing to do. Although they had come to know the old man in this new neighborhood, seeing him so lonely and sad deeply affected them. When Christmas Day arrived, the children decided, with the help of their mothers, to prepare food and sweets for the old man. Their mothers encouraged them, and together they set up a large table with both treats and healthy meals. After happily preparing the food, the children, along with their mothers, left their house to visit the old man. When they arrived, they carefully placed the large plates carrying the food and sweets on the ground. Each of them expressed how much they valued him and how much they wished for his recovery. Their mother was proud to see how kind and right-minded her children had grown. "I'm so glad I raised you well," she said, unable to hold back tears of joy. The children were happy with their mother's words, but their true happiness came from being able to do something good for the old man. When the doorbell rang, the old man remained silent for a while. Finally, when he opened the door, he saw the children standing there, along with the food and sweets. His eyes were a mix of surprise and emotion. The children, smiling at each other, said, "We are always here for you. We hope you get better soon." At first, the old man looked at them in surprise, but then, overwhelmed by deep emotions, tears welled up in his eyes. Slowly, he took the food and thanked the children tearfully. In an instant, all the hardness and anger that he had accumulated over the years melted away. "For you to treat me so kindly. I didn't deserve this," he said. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." The children, quietly but with great sincerity, hugged the old man. In that moment he felt that everything was changing, that his heart and soul were beginning to heal. The kindness the children showed gave him the chance to reconsider his life. And in that moment, a voice inside him rose. To people, to animals.